Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. Our guest today had quite a journey, more than 800 miles on a bike from Missoula, Montana to Steamboat Springs, Colorado. He reports for NPR stations as part of the Mountain West News Bureau, and his journey during an extraordinary election is chronicled in the podcast Facing West. The first season has a subtitle, Across the Great Divide. Yes, that's the continental divide, but more importantly, a political divide that some say has caused long-term damage to the country. We welcome to Newsmakers reporter Nate Hegyi. Nate, it is great to have you with us.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Well, I really appreciate you doing this on the day after the election. What a time to do this interview. And as I was watching earlier this morning, we're taping this on Wednesday, President Trump speaking to the nation in a way no other president ever has after an election, calling the election into question. I was thinking about some of the people I heard on your podcast who are already primed to be, not trustful of institutions in society, government and the media. And I just want to read a few selections of what the president said, because I think it's worthwhile to actually see the words before I have you react to what this might mean long term in the Mountain West and across the country. He said, quote, "We were getting ready to win the election. Frankly, we did win this election. This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment on our country," referring to the votes not being called in key states, as they wouldn't be called because, of course, they haven't all been counted at that point. Trump hinted the White House would push the Supreme Court to rule over disputed ballots, warning that a, quote, "very sad group of people" was trying to disenfranchise voters. Of course, just the opposite is true. Counting all the votes is the opposite of disenfranchising voters. When you heard this, read this stuff, and thought about the people you talked to who are already, in some cases, may believe conspiracy theories, what do you think this means?
I think that the president is very good at creating narratives and very good at creating boogeymen in this country. And there is a large percentage of our country and of the folks that I met in the rural West who really believe these narratives, even though they're false. And they're touted on, in some cases, Fox News, conservative talk radio, and they're essentially operating on a different set of facts than necessarily what we're operating on, I guess. And so I think that people definitely buy into what you called conspiracy theories, and I think that there will be a big percentage of his supporters that will absolutely believe that there's voter fraud happening and that this election was rigged. I think he's been setting the stage for that for weeks now. This is playing directly into his hand in a way.
One of the moments, and there are so many in your podcast that really stood out to me, was showing how the political divide could even be used in terms of public health, a public health emergency. And you interviewed a man who said, quote, What is wrong with you? He does not represent the values of the people that are out here. And this is all framed in the idea that President Trump and others have even used this terrible pandemic as something, as a political divide, that it's a political statement not to wear a mask. And that's framed as freedom. You start your podcast with this gentleman who asked this question: how could this be? But he was a rarity in terms of the people you talked to, wasn't he?
He was, yes. In this part of the rural West that I traveled through, someone who was deeply concerned about COVID-19 wasn't something I ran into in most of the communities. That said, when I was traveling, caseloads were pretty low. We've seen big spikes since then, but there was and it comes back to that idea of people operating on different sets of facts. And the president has sowed distrust in Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's sowed distrust in the CDC. And I think there's a lot of people that are already primed to distrust the government for a lot of reasons. And I think it, again, plays right into his hand is not taking the pandemic seriously, and then not looking at the Trump administration's failure to get control of the pandemic in ways that other countries have as not his fault, And so I think it's really, really great political maneuvering on Trump's part to sow distrust in the folks who are telling us that the pandemic is serious and deadly.
And at the same time, you also say in your podcast, Facing West, that you've never seen the kind of support that Trump has for another politician in the West. Why do you think that is?
The thing I heard over and over again was Trump is a businessman, not a politician. I think it comes, we out West in small towns and rural communities have as I said before, a deep distrust of government and political maneuverings. There was a lot of anger over environmental regulations over the oil and gas industry and things like that. And here Trump comes in, speaking how some folks are feeling, and coming in as not a politician, a businessman, whether he's a successful businessman or not, successful in some ways, not successful in other ways. But people really liked that, and they liked it 4 years later. And they perceive the economy as doing very well, better under Trump than Obama, even though that's not necessarily the case. It was doing about the same in the last 3 years of Obama and the first 3 years of Trump. And as we've seen, over the past, what is it now, almost since March at least, the economy is not doing well, in part because, some of that's not Trump's fault, obviously. COVID-19 is a worldwide pandemic, but our economy is struggling in part because we haven't controlled the virus in ways that, let's say, Canada up north has.
But isn't that interesting, Nate? You say something there in your answer about the fact of the economy, but yet you poll people, and even though the polls were very negative on a lot of issues for President Trump, he did well on the economy. So that narrative that he created, that my economy is the best economy ever, really resonated with people, even though it's not the case, as you point out. But even more importantly, one of the things that's often not mentioned in this is context, that we might say that the economy is significantly doing more poorly, in the sense that there was a massive tax cut during President Trump's administration, first term, that was supposed to really supercharge the economy. So if you add that in, you might say this is really not a good performance, because it's operating on on a lot more help, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. The tax cuts were actually pointed out among a wealthier developer that I spoke with in Driggs, Idaho, which is kind of near Jackson Hole. I mean, that was the reason why he was going to vote for Trump, because he did see a significant cut in his own, personal income taxes, and he saved a lot of money. The idea of job creation as well. Now, Trump created around the same number of jobs were created in the first 3 years of the Trump administration as the last 3 years of the Obama administration. Trump did create more manufacturing jobs. And also, we have to look at deregulation and his championing of the oil and gas industry. That played really well for folks in southern Wyoming when I was biking through that area. There was some single issue voters that when you go to a town like Rollins, which is an oil town, people really liked that he wasn't going to, push something like a Green New Deal. That said, the pandemic has really hurt the oil industry. And I talked to a lot of people that were laid off, but Trump has been successful in separating himself from, the pandemic and responsibility over the pandemic, so that people don't blame him for what's happening right now.
Yeah. You point out in the podcast that Fox News uses the word hate 5 times more than other media. This idea that Democrats hate America, the media hates Trump. You present that in the podcast as a powerful narrative that may also help Trump when he's trying to spread his message about the economy and other issues.
Right, yeah, because you need boogeymen. I mean, in kind of Trump's approach to politics, there is, good and there is evil. And you have to paint a disastrous picture if Democrats gain control. Even though you have a moderate in Biden, I think Republicans and Trump and conservative news media have been very successful in painting the Democrats as party of socialism and Marxism and communism, and people really believe that. And so, when you do have a station like Fox News, using the word hate 5 times more often than other cable news shows or cable news outlets, it helps seed that distrust in another party. And instead of working across the aisle, we can't work with the Democrats. The Democrats are the party of evil.
Yeah. And, one of the quotes that really stood out to me, a person you talked to, he really echoed what President Trump sometimes says or implies. He said, quote, "Get rid of most of the media. They're fueling this thing," the thing being division.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Get rid of the fake news is what he had said. I do think that media has become more polarized over the past 4 years. I think that there's also a frustration when actual facts kind of brush up against what Trump is trying to present as truth, and what his cohort is trying to present as truth. And so again, it's an easy boogeyman to create. Journalists, the Democratic Party, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Antifa, Black Lives Matter. There's an endless list of boogeymen that I think have been created over the past 4 years.
Yeah, and of course this could become, in some instances, more dangerous than just rhetoric. You wrote in a blog post, all this points to the disparity I've witnessed over the past 2 weeks. Some of the kindest, most helpful people I've met on the road openly acknowledge that they are prepping for a coming civil war against an insidious, vague villain on the other side of the political fence. And, in the past, some might have said, well, maybe this is we're a little too worried. But I don't think people now would disagree with your statement.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen gun sales soar over the past year as kind of one point, at least people preparing for some sort of civil unrest, I think. And it is interesting, that disparity, because people were incredibly kind to me, a member of the news media traveling through this area. And I think that there is a huge difference between what we're seeing nationally and maybe what we're seeing, within our local communities and how we're interacting with each other. And I think it all points again to the creation of these boogeymen. That insidious vague villain that I refer to as any number of things that we've been so ramped up to worry about, the other side, and to be prepared for the other side, because they don't have our interests at heart. They have something else at heart. And so, it's pretty. I wondered for a moment whether I was just seeing a small subsection of the country, and that this wasn't how a lot of people felt, and that we were going to see the election, and the election was going to represent that. But I think, as we're seeing how tight stuff is right now, I think that, there's definitely quite a few people that are worried about some civil unrest.
Absolutely. Now, despite all this, we can't be all negative here for the half hour. You told the NPR program Here and Now in a national interview that you came away from this trip with some hope along with concern. Tell me about that. Why do you come away with some hope?
Yeah, that's a tough question to ask on the day after the election. I need to think back as to where I was feeling.
Maybe it's how you used to feel, right?
I have hope that I think that this country is a quilt. I think that, we're all these little communities stitched together, and sometimes it really amazes me that we've worked for so long together as a cohesive unit, and maybe we haven't worked so well together. It's just coming to light now. But there is a beauty of neighbors helping neighbors in small towns, regardless of politics, regardless of religion, color, anything else like that. Whether that's a matter of kindness or survival. These are very, rural, sparse places where the power goes out, and you can't rely necessarily on, your local government. You've got to rely on, your next door neighbor to help you out and dig you out if there's a big snowstorm and things like that. And then there's an inherent kindness in that most people are kind. And I think that when you travel, especially the way I did, very slowly through these towns, meeting people who may not have the same political beliefs as your friends and neighbors back home or things like that, you realize that we are all people. And if we could just have more conversations, and I know that's kind of, a lot of people say that, but if we really could just have more conversations, I think we'd recognize that we aren't as pitted against each other as we think. We have a lot.
Well put. Unfortunately, a lot of the conversations today are not as good, and a lot of them are on social media. And you also talk about this in the podcast and ask people about this. Besides Fox News, you note that social media is a concern, and of course Congress is interested in this too, holding hearings about the effect of social media. Tell me what you could gauge about the influence of social media, Facebook being part of that, in stoking fears and spreading misinformation.
This goes outside of my bicycle trip, but I've spent the past year really focused on rural towns, rural communities and small towns. And I think over and over again, you see how a rumor can spread quickly on social media, so let's take the rumor that Antifa was sending, which isn't necessarily even an organization. It's more of a movement. But the rumor was that members of Antifa were coming by the busload to small towns, suburbs to wreak havoc, after police killed George Floyd. And that's been roundly debunked by local law enforcement agencies and even by the FBI. But at the same time, it continues to thrive on social media and any kind of misinformation. I think that our country really struggles with media literacy. That's not something that we really teach widely in schools, to be able to, especially now, and I understand that there's so much information out there that I think there's a lot of folks who have a hard time discerning, is this true versus is this a rumor? Where is this coming from? What's the source and stuff like that? I think that's a big, that's a big part of why these things kind of fly over the place in social media.
Well, I think it's so important that in your podcast you also note that something very real is also stoking a divide in America, and that's income and wealth. And you cover gentrification in the Mountain West, small towns where real estate has ballooned in value as people move in from out of state.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That was one thing that I think bridged the divide, was that everybody was concerned about growth. Now, that could either be my town isn't growing and I want to see more jobs coming here, or in the case of Steamboat Springs and other kind of beautiful outposts in the West, my town's growing too fast and it's becoming rapidly too expensive for me to live here. And I think that that has been a major issue throughout the Mountain West. Small towns in the West are the fastest growing small towns in the country. And there's big questions about how do we attract the kind of wages to keep up with housing prices. And especially during the pandemic, anecdotally, we've seen a lot of people move out here. And I think that's, I imagine that's going to shift politics. It's going to shift a lot. And there's a lot of people that are worried about that change.
Okay, along with money, another thing comes up though, and you interviewed one woman who said, quote, "Don't bring your mentality with you," talking about people moving in to
Right.
the Mountain West. Another guy says, "Don't bring your, quote, California attitudes." And you get him to define what that means. California attitudes, basically liberal attitudes in the language that's often used in the media. What do you make of this?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I think that there's always been a fear of the outsider.
Yeah.
In a lot of places, right? We could look in big cities and in neighborhoods, whenever you see gentrification, you're concerned, I don't want those kind of people coming into my neighborhood. I like the way my neighborhood is right now. It's also funny because a lot of the same people that were saying this were also outsiders at one point or another, and we've seen in cases like North Idaho, for instance, the Californians that are moving there, they're not liberal Californians. They're actually conservative Californians that are fleeing the liberal politics of California. One thing I noticed is that communities attract like-minded people for the most part. And so if you can kind of fit into that way of life of neighbors helping neighbors, all those boogeymen fears of Californians and the like kind of dissipate if you fit into the community. If you don't fit into the community, it appears then that you've got a problem.
Yeah. Well, you hone in on another issue related to wealth. You've already talked about the fact that some folks depend upon the fossil fuel industry for income, but at the same time, their perhaps decision to embrace Trump and his rhetoric, even rhetoric about coal, the dirtiest of fossil fuels, may resonate. At the same time, while you're taking this bike trip, you're looking at a black sky due to wildfires and man-made climate change. You write, "The uncomfortable truth is that Wyoming's wealth of oil and coal has contributed to man-made climate change and more severe wildfires like the ones blackening the sky throughout the West this September." Do you get a sense, Nate, from your trip that as these incidents become more and more common, this may be a way to bridge the divide, that people will start to pay more attention as to the importance of this issue, even if it means an economic transition for them, their community, their family?
Well, yeah, I mean, you talk about economic transition, and that needs to be, I think there is a history of when we transition from one thing or another of just leaving those towns behind. And I think there's a real palpable fear of that. We've seen, especially with the collapse of coal, which was due to a lot of reasons, including, the fact that there's cheaper and more abundant natural gas. We've seen, people lose their jobs. We've seen companies go bankrupt and not, and governments not come in and give them a good transition to different kinds of jobs and help those towns out. So I think there's a real palpable fear and an understandable fear of that. You don't want your jobs to go away. That said, I've also heard from folks that, yeah, the climate is changing. We don't know the reasons why, but that wildfire that's burning just near my ranch, that's pretty serious. I'm really concerned about it, and I want us to get together and actually come to some solutions with that. And so I do think that, the environment, public lands, climate change can be a potential bridge for these divides because we're seeing it. It also has, I mean, at the same time, we're all seeing the pandemic, and we're seeing how that's become politically divided as well. So,
Of
I don't know,
course,
it can go either way.
as we mentioned, Nate, you didn't contribute to climate change in terms of transportation on this trip because you biked almost 900 miles.
Right.
Tell me
Right.
about that decision. What a heady decision to say to your editor, I'd like to bike 900 miles and do this trip this way. I mean, tell me about how this came about.
Well, it was kind of a crazy idea because I was talking with my managing editor, and we wanted to figure out, well, how do we meet a lot of people in small towns and rural communities? And I've been on bike trips before, and one of the things that you notice is that you just talk to more people. You're moving really slowly across the landscape. You're not in a car, zooming 80 miles per hour, and you also just get to feel the heat and the wind, and you get a real good sense of the landscape. And I wanted to move kind of at the speed of someone on horseback, 10 miles per hour, which is how we experienced the West for centuries before the car. And so, yeah, and I've got a crazy enough editor that she was like, yeah, let's do it. Let's try it out. So then I did it, and it was exhausting. And I have a real appreciation for how big Wyoming is and how big the Great Basin Desert, where there's only 2 towns, I saw a handful of people over the course of 3 days, and a lot more pronghorn than people. So yeah, I definitely got a good perspective of the immense size of this part of the West.
Would you do it again?
Yeah, I would. We're hoping to do it in the spring. Yeah, we have this idea of doing kind of a Sin to Saint ride from Las Vegas to Salt Lake City, talking about faith and morality in America. Because I think, coming out of this winter, so long as the pandemic, that changes everything right now. We'll have to see how the COVID cases are in the spring and whether it's a safe idea or not. But I hope to.
Well, I hope so too. Great journalism, and a great opportunity to sit down with you and talk about it. And I encourage people to listen to Facing West. How can they find it?
Anywhere you get podcasts. So Spotify, iTunes, wherever, just search Facing West.
Nate Hegyi, he is with the Mountain West News Bureau. You hear him on KRWG, public media, and NPR stations across the Mountain West and sometimes across the nation. Nate, great to talk to you.
Thank you, Fred. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. That is our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's morning edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Newsmakers.